Our next speaker is Zachary Gabor, who is a graduate student at Harvard University, and he will be speaking, his paper will be titled Norm, Nature, and Narrative, Two Strategies in Pursuit of a Synoptic Vision in Sellars and Macbeth. So take it away, Zachary.
All right, thanks so much. Yeah, I just want to start out by expressing how fortunate I feel to be here. So this is my first conference dedicated to Sellars that I've been to, and it's a wonderful experience to be in a group of people who are also share my fascination with this endlessly fascinating philosopher. And then also I feel especially fortunate to be able to share some reflections on the philosophy of Danielle Macbeth. So as some of you know, Danielle was my undergraduate advisor, and probably given the circumstances and the topic of my presentation, it goes without saying she was a tremendous influence on me and still is in my development as a philosopher. So I just feel really, really fortunate to be able to share some reflections on her work and on Sellars' work. Oh, and I wanted to say I still have the spiral-bound copy of the page proofs of Realizing Reason from the seminar course on philosophy of math that I took with Danielle on the eve of Realizing Reason's publication. So I just wanted to bring that out as a little prop. Okay, let me share my screen and begin. Okay, so as you'll see, I just at the last moment decided to change the title, Norm, Nature, and Narrative in Sellars and Danielle Macbeth, just because the old one was clunky. And also I realized as I was finishing things up, what I was cared about was not as much synopsis and more stereoscopy. So let's get started. All right, so when I initially wrote this paper, I had this turn of phrase to describe what I thought Sellars was doing in characterizing the philosophical quest, which I was sort of proud of. But then when I returned, I thought, well, I still think this is kind of a catchy turn of phrase, but it's severely underexplained. So let me explain a little bit more what I think Sellars is construing as the philosophical quest at the beginning of Philosophy and Scientific Image of Man. That phrase is making sense of the fact that there's just one world. It's reproduced above as the title of this slide. So as I'm sure you all know, Sellars draws this distinction between the manifest image and the scientific image, two sort of bodies of putative knowledge that we find ourselves with in the sort of present state of things. The scientific image is an image of a world that's populated by quarks and leptons and the like, and in which things happen for the kinds of reasons that physicists adduce for things happening. And then the manifest image is, well, it's populated by all sorts of things, the concepts of which we sort of use to navigate the world knowledgeably. But principally and crucially for my purposes, it's populated by persons and their concomitants. So persons essentially are loci of rights and responsibilities. They can know and be ignorant. They can make sense or not make sense, and they also enjoy sensory experiences. So I'm going to focus on the sort of normative aspects rather than the sort of sensory aspects of the manifest image, just for the topic of this paper. So when I'm thinking about the sort of Sellarsian strategy for achieving a sort of join between the manifest and scientific images, I'm thinking about the aspect of the strategy that addresses the sort of essentially normatively laden aspects of the scientific image. So here's what Sellars says about the philosophical quest. He says, there's a crucial duality which confronts the contemporary philosopher at the very beginning of his enterprise. Here, the most appropriate analogy is stereoscopic vision, where two different perspectives on a landscape are fused into one coherent experience. So I just want to reflect a little bit on that analogy to come to a characterization of what I think Sellars is putting forth as his characterization of the philosophical quest. So two significant features of this stereoscopic vision analogy. So one is realism, or at least quasi-realism. So the image, the analogy suggests, right, we need the need to reconcile not one depiction of the world and one illusion, or what would be worse, two illusions. The analogy requires us to reconcile the idea that the sort of normative claims, which are central in the manifest image, are truths, or at least there are sufficiently refined versions of both bodies of doctrine which are comprised of truths. Now, Sellars is probably correctly described as a quasi-realist about normativity, but nonetheless, he thinks the moral claims that are sort of part of the manifest image are true. And then the second point feature that the analogy suggests is what I'm calling unity, which is really, it's a pair of features in an explanatory relation. So think about, say, examining a landscape with a pair of binoculars. Wherever you look, sure enough, there's a pervasive and systematic correlation between what you see through the left lens and what you see through the right lens. And it's not just that this is a brute fact, there's an explanation for this fact. And the explanation is that these are two images of one and the same landscape being taken in slightly different ways, right? So what this analogy suggests is that, well, there are systematic and pervasive correspondences between the sort of fact patterns of the manifest and scientific images. And I think one way to see this is to think about how thoroughly in a sort of our developed sort of understanding of the world, we rely on interleaving patterns of explanation, which deploy the kinds of ways of explaining things characteristic of science, and then also the kinds of ways of explaining things characteristic of refined common sense. And Sellars, I think the analogy suggests, sees as a challenge to explain how it is that these images are images of one and the same world, of one and the same, in some deep sense, underlying subject matter. Okay. So with those features of the analogy in mind, what I call the stereoscopic challenge is to render this claim, unity, that the pervasive correlations between the images is explained by there being images of, in some sense, the same subject matter, intelligible without giving up either realism or some kind of quasi-realistic commitment, by vindicating, in some sense, the two images. And to circumscribe the kind of approach that I'm going to be focusing on today, something that the approaches of Sellars and Macbeth share, I just want to point out that they are, in a sense, naturalistic in both cases. So in a sense, both approaches aim to meet the stereoscopic challenge by explaining that the facts of the scientific image jointly constitute or amount to the normative significances which are inherent in the manifest image. Now, of course, don't mean to suggest in any way that this kind of naturalism would commit us to any kind of reductivism. So Sellars famously, as I'll discuss, is in one sense reductive about the relation, and in another sense not reductive about the relation. And I'll suggest that Macbeth is more thoroughgoingly non-reductive about the relation between the natural and the normative. But nonetheless, I think both philosophers adopt a strategy that, broadly construed in this sense, is naturalistic. That is, we begin with the world as science tells us that it is, and we seek to understand how anything in that world could amount to the kind of order which is intelligible as normatively significant. I'm okay on time so far. All right, so just a couple of examples of the kind of dilemma that we face that sort of Sellars is responding to in posing for us his characterization of the philosophical quest. So here's one. I've raised it as just a historical example to try and impress sort of that this is really at least as old as modern philosophy. And then the other thing is, I think it's a sort of cautionary tale about what happens if we don't adopt something like a naturalistic approach, or at least what we run the risk of having happen. So Elizabeth famously asked Descartes how material substances act on or get acted on by non-material mental substances. Descartes responds, he feels the force of this worry. Because, he famously already acknowledges in the Meditations that there's got to be some kind of unity of mind and body that's stronger than, say, the unity of a sailor driving a ship. But what he says is that the idea of this unity is primitive. It's one of the primitive ideas on which all of our other knowledge is patterned. So it's primitively intelligible for Descartes. It's intelligible but not explicable on his view. So notice that in this sense, Descartes is taking what I would call a flying leap on the stereoscopic challenge. He's hoping that it makes sense how a world sort of cleaved between two fundamental kinds of substances together form an integrated whole, explanatorily connected integrated whole. It's just, he hopes, immediately clear. If it's not, and I, in fact, worry that it's not, I don't think it is to me, then we have something like an image of two parallel worlds that are related but not intelligibly related. And what we get is a kind of unity, but a unity of adjacency, not a unity of overlap. So what you get is the kind of view that you get when you have, say, some 3D or Oculus Rift sort of binocular stereoscopic vision images imposed side by side, like this. This is not the kind of unity we want. We want one dog rather than two. And then just a second example, which hews closer to sort of the setup of the problem that I'm addressing, is from Mackey. This is part of Mackey's famous argument from queerness. So Mackey importantly sort of thinks of the essential sort of cleavage between these two ways of thinking about the world as between the normative and the non-normative, and that's sort of the aspect that I'm focusing on. So that's more like the setup. The other thing is that Mackey is committed to taking what I call a naturalistic strategy. So what he says we have to do, right, well, is to explain what is the connection between the fact that an action is a piece of deliberate cruelty. He means us to read this non-normatively, which is maybe absurd, but that's another issue, and the moral fact that it is wrong. It cannot be entailment, a logical or semantic necessity, yet it is not merely that the two features occur together. The wrongness must somehow be consequential or supervenient. It is wrong because it is a piece of deliberate cruelty, but just what in the world is signified by this because. And how do we know that the relation that it signifies obtains? So this is from Ethics. And so Mackey thinks that we do have to adopt a naturalistic strategy, and he just despairs of finding one. Okay. So what's the plan for the rest of the talk? So first, I'm going to discuss an approach to the stereoscopic challenge that I find in Sellars. I call this approach the integrated language approach. Second, I'm going to argue that there's a mathematical reason to doubt that this approach will succeed. Purely transfinite combinatorics, mixed with a little philosophy of science. Next, I'm going to describe an alternative approach, a narrative approach from Danielle Macbeth, which I claim is resistant to these kinds of mathematical worries. So on this approach, the normative and the non-normative exhibit a kind of unity and integration that is irreducibly narratively explicable. And I'm going to try and argue that it resists the kind of worry that I raise for Sellars. And then finally, I'm going to suggest that something like this narrative approach, or something like an appreciation of its explanatory power, is implicit already in some of Sellers's writing, and that recognizing this can help us read him. In particular, I think it can help us make more sense of rhetorical tendencies of his that are otherwise, I think, quite puzzling. In particular, what I, in the written version of this paper, sum up as his propensity to philosophize in legends. I think that's an implicit recognition of the power of this kind of approach. Okay, 32 minutes. Okay, so as I say, I call Sellars' strategy the integrated language approach to making intelligible the relation of the normative to the natural scientific. And I call it that because I think in a slogan, what he's doing, or what he suggests, is that we can fashion our images of the world into one image of an integrated whole by fashioning our language into an integrated whole. And the way that I think he thinks we can do this is by exploiting what he calls the causal reducibility of the normative to the non-normative. So the normative is not logically reducible to the natural scientific, according to Sellars. So think his remark in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, that to think the epistemic is reducible to the non-epistemic with however lavish a sprinkling of subjunctives and hypotheticals is a radical mistake of a piece with the naturalistic fallacy in ethics. There's no normative claim which means the same as a non-normative claim. And it would be doing something like the naturalistic fallacy to think that in the normative domain of ethics or the normative domains of, say, philosophical psychology or semantics, which are also normative, because a crucial aspect of the way in which our lives are normatively inflected are the epistemic ways. But it is, Sellars says, causally reducible. And what he means by that is he thinks that there are equivalences between normative claims and what we can think of as something like their footprints in the causal order. So, for example, an equivalence like B's utterance U meant it is raining, if and only if K of B and U, or C's act A was reckless and unwarranted, if and only if J of C and A, where the left-hand side is normatively charged. So as I say, Sellars thinks that even semantic claims are normatively charged. And the right-hand side is in a language that's sort of suitable for doing natural science. And so in Semantical Solution to the Mind-Body Problem, he's thinking mostly about behavioristics, but I argue in a footnote of the paper that really he's committed to the claim that we could do this in fundamental physics just as well as we could do it in behavioristics, just with more work. And as I mentioned in this slide, in Semantical Solution to the Mind-Body Problem, he breaks this into 3 steps. He doesn't actually argue for this. He says, I'm not going to argue for these claims, but he makes it pretty clear that he believes them to be true, that the ethical facts are sort of reducible in terms of their causal footprint to psychological facts, and then the psychological to semantic facts, facts about behavior semantically characterized, and then those in turn to facts about behavior characterized without the use of semantic idioms. Okay, so these kinds of equivalences, I claim, are the kind of sutures that Sellars thinks we can use to sort of splice the 2 images together at bottom. Let me say a little bit more about them in light of my claim about their importance, right? So they're not equivalences in meaning. Oh, I just reproduced the thing that I said in the last slide. Sellars says there's supposed to be extensional equivalences in the semantic solution paper, but he clearly means they're not supposed to just be any kind of truth functional equivalences. So for one thing, the whole point of the paper is that these equivalences are supposed to exhibit a kind of reducibility of the normative to the natural, which you don't get just by claiming that 2 things just happen to, claiming that we can furnish 2 sets of formula that have the same truth values. The other thing is that they're the kind of things that scientists can discover, he says. And he also says that the left-hand side is supposed to convey the information that the right-hand side, the sort of scientific side, states. So they're supposed to be stronger than just any kind of equivalences which have the same truth value. I'm going to argue later that to do the work that he needs them to do, they need to be necessary equivalences. Okay, so how does having such a battery of equivalences render the relation of the normative and the natural intelligible? Such equivalences, I think, provide us the tools with which to make the kinds of characterizations that are relevant for what he says when he talks about joining the images at the end of Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man. So this famous quotation, he says, we join the images when by construing the actions we do and the circumstances in which we do intend to do them in scientific terms, we directly relate the world as conceived by scientific theory to our purposes and make it our world and no longer an alien appendage to the world in which we do our living, right? So the kinds of circumstances in which we're performing our actions that are sort of relevant to rationalizing our actions, the kinds of ones that are relevant in our practical cognition are the ones that are normatively significant, the kind that give reasons to action. And so to be able to characterize those circumstances in scientific terms, what we need is the kind of equivalence that witnesses the reducibility of this situation in which I have a reason for action to some set of physical circumstances. And I think the idea is that once we have this sort of body of doctrine that makes explicit and witnesses the reducibility in terms of causal footprint of the kind of order that is exhibited in our normatively laden activity to the kind of order that is exhibited in the causal order of physics, then a sort of mystery about the connection fades away. So I like to compare here the kind of thing that Patricia Churchland says about the explanatory gap in the philosophy of mind, where what she says is that it's a confusion to think that no neuroscientific facts could explain anything about psychological conscious experience, and this confusion is born of the fact that we just don't know enough about neuroscience yet. If we had a really strong and thoroughgoing conception of the kind of order that is manifest in the experiential goings on that are underwritten by our brain, the explanatory gap would disappear. And so here, I think the thought could be something like the same. There's still, of course, a semantic gap. They're not the same. You're not saying the same thing when you characterize the circumstances that warrant an action in naturalistic terms. But there isn't an explanatory gap anymore because you have such a crystalline picture of the kind of order that fits these two pictures together. I think that's not an implausible hope. It's only that I think we can't get these equivalences to witness the reducibility. And here's why I think this. I think there's a cardinality problem for the integrated language approach. And I'm taking this basically from an argument that shows up in the Cornell realists' work on moral naturalism. It shows up in a Sturgeon paper, a paper by Nicholas Sturgeon, and he cites it to Boyd. But he cites, I think, cites a paper in which I don't actually see the argument showing up, but Boyd makes a very similar argument to related purposes in a different paper. So the basic worry is that there are too many ways in which some properties might be constitutively connected, right? Too many ways in which the natural order might have to map on to the normative order, and not enough formulable causal reducing equivalences for this approach to be likely completable, even in principle. So there are two steps. First step is to argue that to meet the stereoscopic challenge, the causal reducing equivalences have to be necessary equivalences. And then the second part is to argue that in a usable language of physics, we can only state countably many possible causal reducing equivalences, but there are uncountably many candidates for how the normative and the natural scientific can hang together to choose from. And so it is not reasonable to expect that one of the candidate equivalences that we can state actually matches the kind of order that these two realms collectively exhibit. So Sellars does not think that the normative is logically reducible to the natural, but his notion of causal reducibility does imply a kind of linguistic reducibility, which I claim for combinatorial reasons is untenable. Okay, so here's why I think that the equivalences that witness causal reducibility need to be necessary. So suppose, to the contrary, that your formula was something like this: x uttered by y means it is raining if and only if k of x and y, or if you like, substitute as is more appropriate for the present circumstances, equivalence between a moral claim and a natural scientific claim. Suppose that holds for all actual languages, but not all possible languages. That is, either there's a possible language for which the physical property holds and the semantic property doesn't, or vice versa. There's a possible language for which the semantic property holds, but the physical property doesn't. Well, then think about how this kind of equivalence figures in the explanation of how the world manages to fix the meaning of some utterance. It figures incompletely because you need something else going on to have cooperated with the physics satisfying the formula k of x, y, in order not to be thrown into one of the possible worlds where that is either not necessary or not sufficient for the semantic property obtaining. But if your knowledge of the relation is limited to causal reducing equivalences, if that's your cognitive contact with the way in which the normative and the non-normative worlds hang together, then by hypothesis, you don't have the complete explanation. You're left with something mysterious. So that's why I think if you are going to go in for causal reducing equivalences as a witness to the intelligibility of the normative and natural hanging together, you need them to be necessary equivalences. Okay, now combinatorial argument about why we can't have this. There are too many properties. So the first premise is there are at least as many physical properties of bodies and utterances. So I'm running this argument again, so my apologies with the semantic case, just because it just hews more closely to sort of the source material, but I claim that you could run this argument. You run this argument at a higher level with the case of something like a moral obligation as well. As there's many physical properties of bodies and utterances as there are functions which take possible worlds as inputs and give subsets of body utterance pairs in those worlds as outputs. So the thinking behind this is that each such function gives you a set of extensions in all possible worlds of body utterance pairs. And so for each different set of extensions in all possible worlds, you have what theoretically, can be considered a different property. Now, if there are infinitely many possible worlds in which there are body utterance pairs, then it follows by Cantor's theorem that there are uncountably many physical properties of bodies and utterances. Next, any usable language of fundamental physics, or of physics and chemistry, or physics and chemistry and behavioristics, or whatever you like, will include finitely many primitive terms and admit a formula only of finite length. Now, it follows from 3 that any such language will only contain countably many formulae. Now, from this, we say that for any usable language of fundamental physics, there will be uncountably many properties which are not designated by any formula of that language, and only countably many which are designated by some formula thereof. Okay, so following that, I have a kind of principle of indifference. So now we have the argument that, right, there are uncountably many different physical properties that could correspond to a semantic property, but only countably many physical formula with which to name them. So now here's an indifference principle. If X is an F and countably many Fs are Gs, whereas uncountably many Fs are not Gs, and we have no strong positive reason to expect that X is a G, we should not expect X to be a G. And I think there's a way of, with measure theory, making this precise, just how sparse any uncountable set is going to be in or any countable set is going to be in an uncountable set, which I think makes this principle of indifference eminently plausible. Now, putting these together, also with the premise that we don't have a strong positive reason to expect that an arbitrary semantical, psychological, or moral predicate is necessarily extensionally equivalent to a predicate of a given usable language of fundamental physics, or of physics and chemistry and behavioristics, or whatever you like. Putting 4 and 5 together, I claim that we should not expect there to exist causal reducing equivalences to witness the causal reducibility for every moral, psychological, or semantic claim in an ideal language of fundamental physics, or of an ideal language of whatever science you like. That's the cardinality argument that I have. Okay, so where does this leave us? What's the alternative? Well, I suggest there's a narrative alternative. How do we account for the relationship of the normative and the natural scientific orders without being able to enumerate those facts that are necessary and sufficient to constitute normative significances? Well, I think that Danielle Macbeth's book, Realizing Reason, provides us a kind of exemplar of the kind of approach that can be workable for doing this. So, this book is a sustained effort to try and make it intelligible that in a natural world there could grow up beings capable of knowing how things are in themselves, the same for all rational beings. For my purposes, I'm just going to take a very small initial part of what's going on in the book, which is already illustrative of the approach. So this is from chapter 1, entitled Where We Begin. And so in that chapter, we have a schematic narrative, not of how it comes to pass that there came to be rational beings capable of knowing how things are in themselves, the same for all rational beings, but at least how there came to be sapient beings capable of knowing things and knowing how things are in spite of appearances. So there's a schematic narrative about how it came to pass, that things became significant in the relevant ways. So things became epistemically significant, how there became knowers, and so how things became things became intelligible as rational or irrational. And I think, though it's not the focus of this chapter, by the same token, you can apply this approach to thinking about how things became significant as wicked or kind or impermissible, wrong or right. The idea is understand how there might come to be any animals or rational animals at all in this chapter. And like in SSMB, this is broken up into 3 steps. So there's a kind of schematic approach to explaining how out of an inanimate world there could become a living world and the attendant significances of a living world, with things that are significant as healthy, unhealthy, nourishing, and so on and so forth. From there, how we could go from a world in which there are living things, but there are no cultural practices, to a world in which there are cultural practices and the attendant significances involving cultural practices. So that is cultural proprieties, things that we do or things that we don't do for some we. And then there's a kind of schematic narrative account of how we could go from a world in which there are cultural practitioners, but there are not beings capable of knowledge of how things are in the world in spite of appearances, to a world in which there are judges and the normative significances which attend such beings. So why would taking a narrative approach help in the face of the problem? Well, I think it helps taking Macbeth's example of biological evolution to think about an account of, say, the emergences of this characteristics, significances characteristic of the animal kingdom. So with biological evolution, Macbeth says, we have an account of the emergence of these significances that is neither reductive nor mechanistic, which makes reference ineliminably to the kind of order that we see being realized, but it's not defeatist or obscurantist, Macbeth claims. Okay, why is it not defeatist or obscurantist? Well, I claim that an account that is defeatist or obscurantist is so because it leaves us with explanantia without an explanation, things to be explained but no explanation for them, and it denies or forecloses the possibility of providing further explanations for them. Emergence narratives, like the narratives we get in evolution about, say, the origin of the animal kingdom, or evolution augmented by a theory of abiogenesis about the origin of life as such, right? These are indefinitely refinable in a sense that I'll specify. So what that means is, well, you take a snapshot of, say, crude proto-animals, right? Somewhere in the phylogenetic tree, we have something that's evolved that it may be difficult or impossible for us to say whether they're animals or not. Well, no matter. We can still make perfectly clear how it is that starting with a world with no animals, there came to be the kind of order characteristic of a world with animals by saying how they figure in an emergence narrative. That is, by saying how such crude proto-animals might have, or if we get the relevant data, in fact did develop from yet cruder, yet less animal-like beings, and by saying how they might have, or if we get the right data, how they in fact did develop into things that yet further resembled the kind of order that animal lives exhibit. And we can do this even if we can't reductively account for what that kind of order is. That is, even if all that we can do is we can describe it in terms which ineliminably make use of a sort of reference to that kind of order. And the same is true for the other kinds of order that I say are constitutive of normatively significant world. So
Yeah, about 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so take a snapshot of the world in which there are, say, crude proto-animals, as I mentioned, proto-organisms or proto-cultural practitioners, proto-judgers. You may not be able to say, and without causal reducing equivalences, there are situations in which I claim you just won't, there just won't be an answer, even vagueness aside, given a physicalistic characterization. Whether these things are organisms or practitioners or sapients. But we can achieve further explanatory refinement, achieve an understanding of how it is that the world populated by quarks and leptons was always already invested with potential significances. It always harbored the potential to be ordered in the ways characteristic of life or in the ways characteristic of rational lives, by filling in missing links in the narrative. And I have this little picture here. This is a picture of a little marble elevator. To try out an analogy, this isn't in the printed version of the paper because there isn't room. I want to try out this analogy. It's maybe slightly complicated, but I hope that it'll help. I'm curious to know whether you think it helps. So imagine that you have representing the state of the Earth at any given point in time, a little magnetic ball bearing rolling around a room. So paint it blue with some little green continents to make it more suggestive. So wherever it is in the room, right, its coordinates parameterize how things are in the world, right? It's of course absurd to think that we could parameterize how things are in the world in an informative way with 3 parameters, but let's abstract from that absurdity. So imagine the ball is rolling around, and as it rolls around, that represents things changing in the world. And imagine that the room is magnetized in such a way that as things are changing in the world, right, as things are changing in the world, it's difficult or intractable, like the sort of 3-body problem in gravitational dynamics is intractable, to give a sort of explicit formula for how things are going to keep unfolding. But nonetheless, it unfolds according to what a set of laws says about how it will unfold. Now, imagine in this model that in this room are machines like this, marble elevators, which if the ball bearing gets stuck in, induce a kind of order in the way in which the world evolves, the way in which the state of the world evolves. These are the kinds of orders. These are supposed to represent, in a very sort of rough schematic way, the kinds of order that I claim is sort of constitutive of things unfolding in a normatively ordered way, in some sense, whether it be the emergence of life or the emergence of thinking beings, etc. What you have is, if you suppose that at some point this marble elevator catches the ball, it sort of is bouncing around and eventually settles in and it exhibits a kind of order. You have a kind of order that's now being exhibited in the world. You might think if the elevator is also moving around and it's still describing a very complicated path, you can't say in an explicit closed formula what path the ball is now following now that it's on the marble elevator. And there may be many other kinds of elevators that the ball could have ended up on, which exhibit different kinds of orders, and it's hard to specify. Now, but we can nonetheless say, at any given point when the ball is sort of bouncing around and settling in, there is in principle a historical account of what forces were acting on it and how to get the marble to settle into this kind of order, to get closer to just settling down and rolling around, and of what it is once it really is settled down into the kind of order induced by this thing. Now, I'm not claiming that the kind of order of life is like ontologically pre-exists life actually emerging. The role in the model of this ball elevator, though it's sort of misleading because it's a physical object in the model, you should think of it as somehow a force field which manages to act like a ball elevator. It's not ontological. It's just the forces are aligned in such a way that if things go in a certain way, a certain kind of order emerges. And you can tell a story of how things settled into that order without being able to give a closed formula that describes what that order is. And you can indefinitely refine that sort of story step by step of how that order emerges. And in this context, I think it's really useful to think about that viewed from one perspective, terrestrial life on Earth is a particular. It's one big tree-like spatiotemporally extended event. And it may be that the many warring definitions of life come from as a result of the fact that, well, there are many interesting ways in which this particular exhibits a kind of order that we don't see in the non-living parts of the universe. And no one is necessarily privileged, and there may not be a good reductive way to sum up what this kind of order is, but we can point to it. We have cognitive contact with it because we're living it, right? We can point to it and say, this kind of order has emerged.
About 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. All right, so that's that with the analogy. So then my last 5 minutes, I want to discuss a little bit about why I think it's relevant to bring, to keep in mind this kind of a narrative approach and its usefulness in reading Sellars. So Sellars notoriously relies in a bunch of different places on sort of parables or legends or something that looks kind of like historical speculation. So, for example, in Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind, you have the myth of Jones. You have the legend of the original image in which the fundamental objects were only persons being pruned into what we now recognize today as the manifest image. We have something like ontogenetic parables about a kid named Junior developing, becoming a conceptual thinker in The Lever of Archimedes, where he's illustrating a point about the acquisition of color concepts, or in Language as Thought and Communication. This can be puzzling. I think in particular, I think the legend of the original image was kind of dumbfounding when I first read Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, because it's like, what the nerve of this guy to say this without any kind of anthropological evidence. But it's clear he's doing something here, right? The myth of Jones is the one that I'm going to take as sort of my central focus. So what I think is interesting about the myth of Jones is that one thing to see Sellars as doing here is a rational reconstruction, right? The idea is that if there is a way in which things could have unfolded, in which the theory of thoughts, right, could have been posited as a theory, and so positing it puts it in good order, then in some sense we are in good standing to use it now. Something analogous to what people might do in political theory in telling a sort of mythical origin narrative of our political order in terms of something that we could rationally agree to. And I think it's definitely right that this is one of the things that Sellars is trying to do with the myth of Jones. But if that's all that he's doing, then I think it's really hard to make sense of what he says at the end of Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind, which is, but is my myth a mere myth, or does the reader recognize in it the man in his journey from the grunts and groans of the cave to the polydimensional discourse of the salon, or whatever exactly the wording is? These are clearly rhetorical questions. Is my myth a myth, or do you recognize human beings? And the answers are supposed to be no and yes, respectively. So why I think that is, and this is not any kind of a reading of the myth of Jones or of these other sorts of parables from Sellars, but just a sort of program for what we might look for in helping to understand what they're doing for Sellars. It's a program for reading these legendary bits of Sellars, is to think that what he's onto, some of the details that make up this myth, are speculative hypotheses about emergence narratives, right? So this is something like, even though, of course, some of the details need to be abstracted away from, right? There wasn't a guy called Jones or any other guy who, or woman or non-binary person who said, oh, here I have this theory to explain why people are conduct themselves rationally even when they're not explaining what they're doing. But nonetheless, there's something about the inflection, the order in which things are realized, the structure that's induced by asking over and over again, and then what happened. something about that structure, I think, is supposed to, in an abstract way, be reflected in these narratives. And I think an implicit appreciation of the narrative approach might be an explanation of why it is that Sellars is philosophizing in this way. Okay, so with that, I'll thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Okay.
Thank you very much, Zach. And so we will now open it up to questions. And I think it is appropriate that Danielle should get the first question.
You're on mute.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks, Zach. That was really interesting, and I have lots of thoughts. Mostly, mostly just sort of responses, but yeah, this is anyway. So I will give you some of my thoughts. First, I actually do have a suggestion about the technical argument. You might want to look at a piece by Dan Bonavac, who, by the way, is a Haverford graduate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he is defending substitutional interpretation of the quantifiers. And you have a structurally similar problem that there's only, I mean, he's even allowing, well, suppose there are infinitely many names. We quantify over non-denumerable domains in mathematics. How are we going to have a substitutional approach? We're going to run out of names. And so he gives a technical result that tries to deal with that I think you might find interesting.
Great.
I talk a little bit about it in section 6.1 of realizing. Second, I really want to just sort of underline, and so here I'm sort of going against some of the concerns that you raised about Sellars, even if that technical thing can be dealt with. The importance of the idea that there's no sharp boundary, which as you emphasize, Sellars seems to be committed to by his equivalences. And I think that's really important. I think that's coming out of Wittgenstein already, that in the reading machine passages, it just isn't that kind of thing where there are sharp boundaries. So that suggests a more narrative approach. And also, and of course, realizing reason is incredibly Hegelian. And I really think we need to say, well, Hegel had this idea of the narrative. And also the notion of life. For Hegel, the notion of life is absolutely fundamental. And similarly for me, that's where you've got to start. And again, we see Sellars. And I think it's so interesting because it's almost as if this is, Sellars is inheriting this dichotomy of the merely physical and the, as it were, hyper-rational. And then it's like, wow, how do we get those two things together? And it looks impossible, but it's because you're not looking at anything in between. So I think, I think that was really, really helpful. On your last point about this, the narrative strands in Sellars, I think that's really insightful. And it's an example of what you're talking about, because, I'm a student of Sellars, and I'm pulling out of Sellars something that you're saying is, look, it's potentially there in Sellars.
Right.
Yes, and I think that's how philosophy works.
Yeah.
So Sellars
Right. Yeah.
He has these new ideas, but he's being pulled back by some of the ideas he inherits from his teachers. So very, very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Ode.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Zachary, and welcome to the tribe. You made quite an entrance, so congratulations. I would like to come back to the very point you ended up with about should we read the myth as a mere myth. And
Okay.
I agree that there is obviously much more than a kind of rhetorical figure here. And something that I've been meaning to do for a while, and obviously I won't do it, so maybe you could consider it for your PhD, is to compare the use that Sellars does of all those artifacts like the myth of Jones, especially the myth of Jones, but also the distinction between the manifest and the scientific image and so forth, and compare the use that he makes of those narratives with the way modern philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I know that we French have a weird way to say Rousseau, but still, Jacques Rousseau, and the idea of the social contract. That is who never existed, who probably won't ever exist and has never existed, blah, blah, blah. And is that just a fiction? And what's the use of this fiction? And obviously it's more than just a reconstruction, or it has more than a pedagogical intent. And for instance, and that goes in your way, for instance, this idea that, for instance, language is primer compared to thought. Of course, ontologically or chronologically, it's not true. We think before we talk. But psychology of development seems to back Sellars' speculation. That is, young children, they learn to refer to themselves as, let's say, Anna or Mike before they're able to say I, because they have to master the self-reference and the deictic concept. So maybe that's a very traditional technique that Sellars is borrowing from modern philosophers, and this use of fiction as the social contract. What would you say about that? Is it something you have in mind?
It's not something I'd really thought about explicitly much, but yeah, as you suggested, I think you're definitely right. There is of course this sense in which the sort of a social contract sort of being built out of state of nature is a kind of fiction. But then at the same time, right, it is a historical fact, I think at least, that out of a milieu in which there were animals who were socially organized in families and small tribes, there emerged the kind of order that's characteristic of political animals. That's a kind of order that was potentially sort of seeded in the world, and under the right conditions, it became realized. And it has, if not the sort of explicit order all thought out preceding the thing, bits of, I'm sure, conceptual thought and planning and stuff in faltering and halting ways, directing it in one way or another a little bit, though of course, the total development is in a way, out of any one person's or even any one group of people's control. So yeah, I'm totally on board with that comparison. I don't know how much I can do with it just because I know so little about political philosophy. But I think that's a great point.
Nicholas.
Thanks, Zach. I've got a question about the cardinality argument, and maybe maybe I just misunderstood it. But anyways, here's the thing. So we got like metaphysical categories. In this case, scientific, the stuff of science, the physical stuff, and the stuff of the manifest image, which is all the other stuff. And you got theories about them, your scientific theories, and then the theory that you use to describe the manifest image. Now, when people are interested in reductive programs, it seems to me that usually what they're interested in is saying that the metaphysical stuff is actually identical. And the way you pull off the program is by showing how to translate one of the theories into the other one. Now, translating one theory into another one, you can't get a cardinality problem because they're both going to be countable, at most countable, right? So infinitely countable. So the problem you get is when you're trying to take the objects of a theory and match them onto the metaphysical categories, which can be uncountable. I take it that's the problem you got here. Okay. But it seems to me what that shows is that you can't pull off the reduction. You can't show that the things that you talk about in one category are the things that you talk about in the other. It doesn't show that they aren't, right? Because it's not a metaphysical claim. It's a claim about how the theory and the things mismatch, like at least the numbers of the things mismatch. So what your argument actually shows is that you can't do the reduction. But I don't know how problematic that is. I mean, well, okay. So here's why I think that might not be terribly problematic. Because when philosophers make reductive claims, they almost never actually try to do the reductions. Like Carnap did in Galileo, and it didn't work. But besides that, like they say, hey, we should think about one class of things in the way we think about another class of things, but they never try to pull it off. You know, Smart and Place didn't show you which brain states are identical to pain and which are identical to pickles, and they just said, hey, like here's the way that we should think about phenomenal states or mental states in general. The metaphysical category is identical to the brain state category. They didn't try to pull off the reduction. What your demonstration shows is that the reduction Sellars wants can't be pulled off. But it doesn't show but if Sellars is looking at reductions in the same way that philosophers almost always do, he's not going to try to do it anyways. Like, it's still interesting that it can't be done, but philosophers aren't interested in doing the reductions themselves anyhow.
And I mean, with your general observation, I completely agree. I think the wrinkle here is that I'm arguing that for Sellars, this reducibility in principle, that the idea that this reduction could in principle be done is supposed to witness the possibility of getting something to make sense to us, right? The possibility of the normative world order and the world order that physics describes as hanging together in an intelligible way. So if the end of the program is intelligibility, then it actually, I think, really does matter whether the thing can be carried off or not. And so the objection is not to some kind of sort of ontological constitution claim that's like in some deep sense, right? Everything is made up of quarks and leptons and what have you. But to the idea that our understanding of how these things are made up of quarks and leptons can be fully delivered in the form of the kind of reduction that I'm claiming can't be done. So we need something else to get it to make sense. Is the thing.
Jim.
Hi, I thought that was really excellent.
Thank you.
So I have a couple of different kinds of questions, but one is on the narrative thing. I mean, Sellars says so many things that make one want to just have atoms in the void and persons. And he has this narrative in the, I'm going to do this tomorrow a bit, but he has this narrative in I'm not going to do it too much. So in the fourth part of Philosophy and the Scientific Image, and that narrative can also look oversimple. It can look like, oh, sure, there's higher level laws, but look, let's just go straight to identify everything with the objects of physics. But I think if you look at it more closely, he tells a narrative about how any given lower level what it would really take for it to reduce the next upper level.
Yeah.
So it has to have so especially, he says, in the context of evolutionary theory, then we're talking about goal-directed behavior, he says.
Yeah.
And he says that could be described just in terms of correlations or patterns.
Yeah.
But what he says is the crucial thing is that there are normal conditions, quasi-normative normal conditions for any functional level. And then there are breakdowns. And what the next lower level is especially good at is explaining the breakdowns. It's like Dennett's design stance in relation to the intentional stance.
Wow.
And like Jeremy Coons and working with Mark Lang's McDowellian argument, Sellars it's clear that here you have to have the upper level kinds in view. So he's not just changing the subject to the lower level and saying the upper level was useful. He's saying the next lower level targets the upper level normality conditions and its breakdowns.
Yeah.
And can offer, it's a sketch, it's a narrative, can offer explanations of both why it worked and why it didn't. So, I mean, my suggestion is that it's a kind of synchronic levels analog of the way he does diachronic theory change. So Einstein doesn't just change the subject, he has to model Newton's kinds, and failures, and so on. So anyway, the one suggestion is that that's a narrative about how we get down to the bottom and how you build back up to the top. But another observation is, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but it's highly significant that he begins PSIM 7, the final section, by saying, can we extend this all the way up? And he says, no. So he says that sort of model won't work, and for a logical reasoning concerning the irreducibility of the ought to the is. But anyway, I'll be talking about that tomorrow. But the second, so first question is just, there's a narrative that could really suit what you're doing.
That's
And the second
I'm sorry, I just missed really quickly. So what was the principal work that you're citing? Is this as appearing in?
Oh, PSIM. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, it's a PSI. Oh, right, okay, right. In the reducibility. Okay, I need to go back and read those.
The fourth
commentary in mind.
The
that's fascinating to me.
Yeah, 4 sections called the scientific evidence. It deals with these levels. And that can get away from the thing Sellars encourages. And you have to read it a certain way. It's just persons and atoms in the void. And then, unfortunately, part 7 says you can't do that same thing all the way up. But that's another issue. That relates to just the second question I had, was just the footprint. So those equivalences in the semantic solution paper. I mean, ultimately, he says he rejects extensionalism. He rejects that you're going to, I mean, you can say this is because the sayings of X means Y are conceptually irreducible or logically irreducible. That's why you don't get the extensionality thesis, because he denies you get the extensionality thesis in the end. But the equivalences are a bit odd, because it's that the normative language or the means language or the about language conveys all this extensional information about semantical habits. But they're always going to be incomplete. I mean, they're going to be, the extensional, the rule that says stop if there's a yellow light, that's going to be imperfectly reflected in the espousal of principles is only reflected in uniformities of performance. You're not going to get a footprint that's extensionally equivalent to the norm. So it's another problem. That's another problem for the causal reducibility way of doing things.
The idea being that, well, the principle espoused, that whatever principle espoused is instituted by some kind of uniformity of behavior, but that uniformity is only approximate. That is, it'll be instituted by a normative term like means or about or ought. And the uniformities
So I agree with you. There's a causal footprint, and he thinks that's absolutely crucial. But I think there's an additional problem, which is, and Jeremy's in his book, he raises some of these problems for causal reducibility. You're not going to get an extensional equivalent between upshots of endorsing normative things and the endorsing of them of the principles is only imperfectly reflected in
Yeah, my thought is that there's stuff that I sort of agree that I don't think Sellars comes out and says it clearly that I found, but I think there's stuff to be said on his behalf here, which is something like, well, there are necessary and sufficient conditions for in theory, if there were this kind of causal on this kind of approach, you might expect there to be necessary and sufficient conditions for imperfect uniformities to count as and also zooming out, not just imperfect uniformities, but also the kinds of sanctioning behaviors that regulate these uniformities that Brandom, for instance, makes so much of. You might think that that's where the equivalence lies, and so I think I sort of So I think that maybe there's something on behalf of Sellars to be said in response to this, but even if that kind of worry is superable, I still have this cardinality worry.
Just by the way, that would fit the breaks explaining the normality and the breakdown conditions.
Right. Yeah. Thanks.
So we have one more hand, Kyle Ferguson.
Hi, Zach. Great job. That was super interesting.
Oh, thank you.
So Dan Dennett talks about intuition pumps. And he says that, Plato's cave, Descartes' evil genius, the state of nature, these are all the greatest hits of philosophy. And all they are little stories that are designed to pump certain intuitions. I always thought of the Myth of Jones as another track on the greatest hits. And I'm wondering whether this last slide here, when you're wondering whether it's a rational reconstruction or when you're suggesting it's an emergence narrative, whether that's saying that it's more or something distinct from an intuition pump. And if it's different from an intuition pump, what do we get out of looking at it that way?
What if you can say a little bit more about what it is that what you're thinking of the intuition pump as being designed to do on the intuition pump reading of the myth?
Well, no.
Right, no. Okay. Fair enough.
But so are you just saying? Are you saying it is an intuition pump, and this is the intuition it's pumping?
Well, I think that. I think that's a really interesting suggestion. I'm not sure that I'm saying that, but I might be. What ultimately I think is, as I say, is being committed to is that, or what is implicitly being committed to, why it helps, why the Myth of Jones helps, is ultimately not just that it's a rational reconstruction that shows something about self-conscious talk as being in good standing, but also that it shows something, I don't know exactly what, but something about the order in which self-consciousness developed, kind of order that's sort of exhibited by asking what happened next. And of course, what is being shown about the order is not exactly what the Genius Jones narrative says. It's not what the Myth of Jones says. So in that sense, it's kind of an intuition pump. It's like, intuitively, intuitively, this is a kind of representation of the way in which the order emerged that adequates in one way or another, and hence. Well, actually, here's a disanalogy with intuition pumps, I think. Intuition pumps generally, I think, are trying to force you into one thing, whereas this is supposed to be a suggestion, right? Or so, I think the Myth of Jones is, in some sense, it's a suggestion. It's it's supposed to outline, it's supposed to outline, yeah, a kind of suggestion about how the sort of order constitutive of self-conscious beings in the world emerged. I'm not sure, this is all, yeah, all very crude. I don't know what to think, but that's a really interesting suggestion. So thanks.
So we're officially out of time. So let's thank our speaker. We may be able to stick around for some informal discussion afterwards.
Okay. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, officially we don't have any socializing planned for today, but we can stick around. I'll leave it open here, and then also let us know, Jeremy or myself, via email how that our socializing session yesterday went for you, because we are thinking about doing something similar tomorrow again. And so if you thought it was a dud, please let us know.
Yeah, I mean, our session went quite well, and so I if other people had a similar experience, then I mean, from my perspective, it went well.
I'd like to ask one more question of Zach. Sellars has an article written with Paul Meehl on the concept of emergence. Have you ever looked at whether, I mean, you're talking about an emergence narrative is very interesting.
Yeah.
And it does, resonate well with evolutionary explanations. I've never really looked at, I always thought it was a lacuna in Sellars that he didn't say more about the nature of biology and how, because that seems to me as the important link between the physics that he, thought everything was going to end up being describable in, and the persons that are not describable really just in physics, although at some point they are. But biology is sort of in the middle there, and he never says much about it. But the notion of an emergence narrative is an interesting one, and it's not clear to me exactly how well that maps onto his own conception of emergence. But I haven't. I just started thinking about it. But I thought that'd be something that you might want to take a look at and see whether you can accommodate his version of emergence in that notion. That'd be an interesting thing to see.
Yeah. I wonder, I sort of tend to agree with your sort of skepticism, be skeptical that the kind of emergence that he's talking about in that paper with Meehl is sort of the kind that exhibits, takes a narrative to exhibit its form. Because I think, does he say in that paper that it's supposed to be the kinds of special laws that govern physics only inside human cortexes? They're in principle like deducible from the fundamental laws, I think, right?
Yeah, I guess as I understand it, he says that for something to be emergent is for there to be a specific sort of realm in which there are essentially different laws, that is, laws that themselves operate only within a certain set of parameters, but within those parameters operate in a law-like fashion. And of course, that could be the kind of story that that's going on in biology. In biology, you're setting up, biologists are investigating the law-like interactions in things like the cell. And the cell is a context in which things happen that just don't happen otherwise. And maybe brains are also a context in which things happen that just don't happen otherwise. But there, so that's just a suggestion is some place that might be an interesting exploration. I agree. I think probably I'll need to go back and look, but I think he still has a kind of problematic commitment about how the lower level and the realm in which the special sciences occur are sort of deductively connected.
Can I say something about the myth of Jones?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me it already is a kind of emergence narrative, because the
Mhm.
whole dialectic of empiricism and the philosophy of mind is looking for an intrinsic characterization of the common descriptive content of qualitative existential looks and seeings. That's
Mhm.
what's driving it. And
Yeah.
and that's what you get at the end. I mean, all the way along, he's saying, how do we combine privacy with intersubjectivity? How do we talk about what is private? How do we give an intrinsic characterization of that common descriptive content? And I take it that, again, we have a kind of narrative of how you can get from here to there.
Yeah.
So I think that is, that's not just a rational reconstruction. I think it's intended to be a kind of narrative of emergence that, look, sort of the way I do in Realizing Reason, think about it this way, which I take to very Wittgensteinian. This story tells you how you can combine what initially looked uncombinable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is I mean, if you keep in mind the question it's supposed to answer, and that's why you need those two stages. You need thoughts and then sensation.
Right. Yeah.
And that's why it ends where it
and
is.
it actually, it's interesting because one thing has to do with how you could have introspective self-knowledge, that kind of privacy of your states. In if language is public and all that. He does that for thoughts, then he does it for inner perceivings and so on. But then the final problem is you never get to the intrinsic character until you tell this story about micro neurophysiology.
Yeah.
But that's just, I agree with what you said. Yeah.